The jar cracked before Mara Ellison said a word. It was a full quart of preserved peaches, packed in summer syrup and sealed under waxed cloth. She had carried it across Dry Mercy Crossing in a covered basket. Past the feed store. Past the hitching rail. Past the men standing in front of the barber shop, pretending not to watch her. By the time she reached the church kitchen, 3 women had already made room for their judgment. Not with open cruelty. That would have been cleaner. They did it with lowered voices and soft concern. The kind that wore gloves to hide its claws. She means well. Nora Vale said near the flower bin. She always does. Beth Vale answered. A third woman gave a small sigh. Still. A woman ought to know when she is too much. Mara stopped with one hand on the basket handle. The room smelled of yeast, coffee, and hot iron from the stove. A white cloth had been spread over the long table for the relief baskets. Someone had stacked tin plates near the window. Outside, the wind dragged dust along the church steps. Mara had heard such words before. In Pevs. At Socials. Beside market stalls. Over garden fences. For years. She had let them pass because people in small towns like to call silence dignity. Mara had once believed them. That morning, she did not. She took the jar of peaches from her basket and set it on the table. Too hard. Glass split down one side with a thin, sharp sound. Syrup ran across the white cloth. Slow and golden. Carrying 1/2 moon slice of peach with it until it slipped over the table edge and dropped to the floor. Every woman in the kitchen went still. Mara looked at the crack in the jar. Then at Nora Vale. Then at Beth. She picked up a shard of glass with a folded towel and laid it carefully on the cloth. Nói trước mặt tao, she said quietly. Though the rest came in English. Cold and plain. Say it to my face. Or keep your mouth shut. No one moved. The stove popped once. Mara put the towel down, lifted her empty basket, and walked out through the side door before any of them found a softer way to be cruel. By noon, every road in Dry Mercy Crossing had heard about the peaches. Cal Rourke heard it standing knee-deep in the south pasture ditch. Shovel in hand. Mud drying on his sleeves. Silas Pruitt from the feed store was the first to bring it. She smashed a jar in the church kitchen. Silas said, leaning on the fence like he had paid rent there. Right in front of the Vale women. Syrup everywhere. Was anybody hurt? Cal asked. No. Then I reckon the table will live. Silas blinked. That ain't the point. Cal drove the shovel into the ditch bank and turned up another slab of dry earth. It is to me. The second version came from Tobe, his youngest hand, who shouted it from the barn door like he was calling a stampede. Miss Mara near scared the auxiliary clean out of their aprons. Cal did not look up. Good. Tobe paused. Good. Some folks need scaring before they learn manners. By late afternoon, Reverend Tully came down the road with his hat in both hands. That worried Cal more than gossip. The old preacher stood beside the ditch and watched the thin line of water struggle through cracked mud. She may leave after the dry season, he said. Cal's shovel stopped. Across the road, the Ellison house sat behind 2 cottonwoods. Its kitchen curtains were drawn, though Mara usually kept them open until supper. What makes you say that? Cal asked. Reverend Tully looked toward the house. Because, this morning was the first time I ever saw Mara stop pretending words don't cut. When a woman stops pretending, she is either ready to fight or ready to go. Cal said nothing. The preacher put on his hat and walked away. Near sundown, Mara came out of her house with a basket on her arm. Of course, she had a basket. Mara Ellison could be wounded to the bone and still remember somebody else needed supper. Cal leaned on the fence. Mara. She turned. The low light caught the dust on her hem and the tiredness around her eyes. She straightened the moment she saw him looking. Cal. I heard about the peaches. I expect the whole county did. I also expect they deserved worse. Her mouth shifted. Almost a smile. But not enough to save either of them from the truth standing between the road and the ditch. Mara looked down at the basket. I'm tired of acting like it doesn't matter. You don't have to act that way with me. She looked at him then. Really looked. For 8 years. Mara had brought soup when his father died. Blankets when his barn roof sagged under snow. And jars of peaches every September because he never remembered to put up anything sweet for winter. For 8 years. Cal had told himself she was a neighbor. A good woman. A steady friend. Safe words for a man too afraid to name what stood in front of him. He swallowed. Whoever gets to stand beside you one day will be the luckiest man in this territory. Mara went still. The basket handle creaked under her grip. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that the ditch water nearly covered it. For 8 years. Cal. I thought it might be you. Then she turned and walked down the road toward Mrs. Wren's place. Shoulders straight. Basket steady. Never looking back. Cal stood by the dry ditch until the sun dropped behind the cottonwoods. The water kept moving. Thin and stubborn. But the ground under him no longer felt solid. Cal Rourke did not sleep much that night. He tried. He lay in the dark with a window open to the dry Montana air, listening to the cattle shift in the lower pen and the cottonwoods scrape softly along the road. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that gave a man room to hear things he had spent years not hearing. For 8 years. Cal. He turned onto his back and stared at the ceiling. He had faced bad winters. Bank letters. Fence lines torn by storm. Sick calves. And the long, slow bite of drought, without losing his head. But 6 words from Mara Ellison had done what none of those things had managed. They had made him feel like a fool. Not because she had spoken them. Because he had needed her to. Morning came pale and dry. Cal was already outside before the sun cleared the barn roof. Digging again at the south pasture ditch. The water in it moved thin as string. Not enough for late summer. Not enough for cattle. Not enough for a man whose banknote came due before the first frost. Tobe came by with a coil of rope over one shoulder. You working that same stretch again? The flow's wrong. Drought'll do that. Cal looked down the ditch line toward the bend near the Ellison property. Drought doesn't make water turn dishonest. Toby decided that was not a sentence he wanted to answer and kept walking. By mid-morning, Mara crossed the road. She wore a plain brown dress and carried a folded blue kerchief in one hand, along with a paper tucked beneath her arm. No basket today. That, more than anything, told Cal the world had changed. She stopped on the far side of the ditch. Your south pasture is being shorted, she said. No greeting. No softness. Just the thing itself. Cal rested both hands on the shovel. By the drought. By the cooperative. She held out the paper. He stepped across the narrow board bridge and took it. It was a water allotment sheet from the grain cooperative. Marked with names. Dates. And ditch turns. Cal knew the paper. He had seen versions of it every summer since his father was alive. Only this one had his ranch listed 2 days later than agreed. That's wrong, he said. I know. He looked at her. How? Because Mrs. Wren asked me to copy the first list when the clerk was sick. You were marked for Tuesday. This one says Thursday. Cal studied the signature at the bottom. Harbin didn't sign this. No. Mara said. He didn't. A hot, slow anger moved through Cal's chest. Silas pruit. I can't prove that. But you think it? I think Silas sells feed, she said. I think thirsty cattle eat weak. I think weak pasture makes desperate ranchers buy more than they planned. And I think a man who smiles too much at the feed counter usually has a reason. Cal looked across the road at the feed store sign in the distance. The Rourke ranch was already thin at the edges. His father's old debt had not vanished just because the old man had. Cal had been paying it year by year. Season by season. Taking pride in making every due date even when pride was the only thing left in the account. Mara seemed to read the thought. You should show me the ledger, she said. No. The word came too fast. Her face did not change. But the space between them did. Cal set the allotment sheet down on the fence rail. It's not your burden. Mara gave a small, tired breath. There it is. What? That word men use when they mean they would rather drown standing up than take a hand. I'm not drowning. No. You're just measuring the water as it rises. He looked at her then. Really looked. The morning sun caught the dust along her sleeve. Her hand rested on the blue kerchief. Thumb pressed into the cloth. Steady but not easy. She had walked over here with proof in her hand and courage in her spine. And he had answered her, like help was an insult. I don't want to pull you into my father's mistakes, he said. Mara's voice softened. But only a little. Cal. I am not asking to be rescued. And I am not asking to rescue you. Then what are you asking? To be treated like someone who already stands close enough to see the fire. Neither of them spoke. The ditch ran between their boots. Shallow and stubborn. At last. Cal turned toward the house. Ledgers on the kitchen table. Mara looked at him for a moment before crossing the board bridge. Inside. The ranch kitchen smelled of coffee. Dust. And old wood. Cal set the debt book before her like a man laying down a weapon he had carried too long. Mara opened it. She did not gasp. Did not pity him. Did not make the numbers smaller than they were. She only read. After a while. She tapped one line with her finger. You're paying feed at Silas Pruitt's winter rate. It's August. Yes. She said. That's the point. Cal stood behind his chair. Jaw tight. Mara looked up. This is not just drought. Outside. The water in the ditch kept moving past the house. Carrying less than it owed. And on the bottom of the allotment sheet. The false signature waited in ink. Small enough to miss and large enough to ruin a ranch. The church bell rang before the sky changed. Not the Sunday bell. Not the noon bell. This one struck hard and uneven. With too much fear in the hand pulling the rope. Cal Rourke was in the barn. Checking a cracked harness strap. When the first clang rolled over Dry Mercy Crossing. He stopped with the leather in both hands. Tobe came through the doorway a second later. Face pale under the dust. Fire. The boy said. Cal was already moving. Outside. Smoke stood beyond the Vale Farms. Dark against the hard blue sky. The wind pushed it east. Fast and low. Over grass that had gone 6 weeks without mercy. Cal looked once toward the south pasture. Dry hay. Weak fence. Cattle too close to the lower draw. Then he looked toward town. The bell rang again. And somewhere between those two sounds. His mind found Mara. He saddled in less than 5 minutes. By the time he reached the road. Men were riding toward the fire line. Women were gathering children. And wagons were being turned toward the church. Dust rose behind every wheel. Dogs barked. Someone shouted for water barrels. Someone else shouted for rope. Cal found Tom Vale standing at his gate. Hat in his hands. Staring toward the smoke as if the world had betrayed him personally. Family? Cal asked. At church. Tom said. Beth took them. Livestock. 2 horses in the east shed. Cal did not waste words. He rode wide around the worst of the smoke and came back with both horses loose and running toward the road. Tom caught one by the bridle and looked at Cal as if he meant to say something large. Cal shook his head. Get them watered. Then go to the church. He rode on. By the time he reached the churchyard, Mara had turned panic into order. That was the only word for it. Order. The church hall doors stood open. Water barrels lined the side wall. Quilts were stacked by family. Children sat in the schoolroom with tin cups in their hands. Women moved in lines. Passing wet sacks. Lanterns. Food. And bandages without stepping on one another because Mara stood in the middle of it all with a ledger in one hand and a pencil in the other. Her dress was streaked with ash. A blue kerchief was tied around her wrist. Her hair had come loose near one cheek. She looked tired already. But not uncertain. Never uncertain. Cal. She called before he reached the steps. I need riders. You have one. Garfield Place first. Then the 2 claims east of the creek. They're downwind and they may not see the smoke until it's too late. Tobe can take the creek road. Send him with a second horse. Mrs. Garfield won't leave without the medicine chest. And she won't carry it on foot. Cal looked at her ledger. Names. Wagons. Wells. Children. Old folks. Livestock. Every weakness in the county, written down because Mara had remembered what other people forgot about themselves. You planned for this. He said. I listened. She answered. Folks tell you what they lack long before they need it. He held her eyes a beat too long. Then someone called her name. And she turned away. Cal rode the eastern circuit with Tobe until the sun lowered into smoke. They warned 3 families. Argued one stubborn man off his porch. And sent 2 wagons toward the church, loaded with more children than supplies. When he came back near dark. The church hall was full. Not quiet. Not calm. But held together. And everywhere Cal looked. He saw people who had once whispered about Mara Ellison, now waiting for her word, like it was the only solid thing left in town. Silas Pruitt stood near the side door, speaking low to a freight man beside a wagon marked with his store sign. 2 water barrels sat in the back, covered under canvas. Mara saw them too. Her pencil stopped. Silas smiled at her from across the yard. Store supply. Can't give away what I may need tomorrow. Mara walked to the wagon and lifted the canvas. The barrels were full. Behind her, a woman with 2 coughing children watched in silence. An old man sat on the church step with an empty cup in his hand. Mara did not raise her voice. She only looked at Silas and said, "Then I'll write down who had water and who kept it." The smile left his face. Not all at once. Just enough. Cal stepped beside Mara. Not in front of her. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him. And for one moment, the strength in her face slipped into something like relief. "Take those barrels inside." Silas opened his mouth. Cal looked at him. Silas closed it. By midnight, the fire had turned east enough to spare the church road. Men came in blackened with dust and exhaustion. Families slept against walls. Children curled under quilts from homes they might not see again until morning. Mara kept moving. At last, near the wagon line, Cal caught her hand. Just for a second. Her fingers were cold. "You need to sit," he said. "So does half the town. Half the town is sitting because of you." She looked away. He tightened his hold. "Careful but certain." "Mara." She looked back. The bell rope hung still above the church steps. Smoke drifted over the moon. Around them, Dry Mercy Crossing breathed because she had not stopped moving. Cal's voice came low. "I don't want to stand on the other side of that ditch anymore." Mara said nothing. But she did not pull her hand away. Behind them, Silas Pruitt stood near his wagon, watching the relief ledger in Mara's other hand, like it had become a loaded gun. By morning, the fire was out. By noon, the rumor had started. That was how Dry Mercy Crossing healed itself when it did not know what to do with shame. It picked up another stone and threw it somewhere else. Silas Pruitt made sure the stone landed at Mara Ellison's feet. Cal heard the first version at the feed store, where 2 ranchers stood near the counter, speaking low enough to pretend they were decent men. "Relief ledger has her name all over it," one said. "Funny how a woman can become important when she's the one holding the pencil." Cal set a sack of salt on the counter hard enough to stop both men talking. Silas looked up from behind the register. All smooth face and careful hands. "Morning, Cal. I need winter feed, priced fair." Silas smiled. Fair is a word folks use when they don't like the number. Then use honest. The smile held. But the eyes did not. "You've had a hard few days. Fire unsettles a man. Lying does worse." The store went quiet. Silas leaned one hand on the counter. "Careful. Folks are already asking questions about how supplies were handled at the church. Wouldn't want your name tangled in a bad matter." Cal stepped closer. "My name tangles where I put it." Silas glanced toward the street. "And where does Miss Ellison put it for you?" Cal did not answer with his hands. He had learned long ago that anger spent wrong always cost more than it bought. He took his receipt and left. Outside, the whole town seemed to be watching without looking. At the church hall, Mara stood beside the relief table, sorting unused blankets with Mrs. Wren. The cut on her hand had been wrapped in a clean strip of cloth. The blue kerchief was gone from her wrist. Cal noticed that. He noticed everything now. "Mara," he said. She looked up. The room between them had changed since midnight by the wagon line. It had grown warmer. And more dangerous. "I have to ride to town," he said. "Bank man from Billings is due." "For the renewal?" "Yes." Her face steadied. "Take the allotment sheet. And the feed receipts." "I will. And don't let them talk you into signing before reading the second page." He almost smiled. "You've said that before. You still need hearing it." He wanted to ask her to come. He did not. Not because he doubted her. Because Silas had already put her name in dirty mouths. And Cal thought, wrongly, that keeping her outside the bank office would keep mud off her dress. He rode before he could explain. That was his first mistake. His second was meeting the banker in the back room of the telegraph office, where half a conversation could travel farther than a whole truth. Mara came by near dusk with a basket of folded linens for the church. She stopped when she saw Cal through the side window. The banker from Billings sat across from him. Jory Miles, the cooperative clerk, stood near the wall. Papers lay open on the desk. She did not mean to listen. But she heard her name. If Miss Ellison is listed, the banker said. It changes the risk. Cal's voice came lower. Her name stays clean if this fails. And if it holds, then she has standing. Not charity. Not gossip. Standing. The banker tapped the paper. You understand, this ties her to the ranch account. I understand. Mara stepped back from the window. Her chest felt tight. Standing. Account. Risk. She had spent 8 years bringing food. Tending sick rooms. Keeping books. Remembering birthdays. Mending what other people tore. And now the man she loved had put her name inside a bank conversation without asking her first. Maybe he meant honor. Maybe he meant protection. But usefulness and love had always sounded too close when spoken by people who needed something. She was gone before Cal came out. When he reached her house after dark, the blue kerchief was tied to the fence post between their properties. The same kerchief she had worn through the fire. The same one that had marked her place beside him. Now it hung there like a closed gate. Mara opened the door before he knocked. You put my name in a banknote, she said. Cal stopped on the porch. I put your name where it would be respected. You put it where it would help you. No. Did you ask me? His silence answered too slowly. Mara's face did not break. That made it worse. I am not a spare beam for your ranch. Cal. I know that. Do you? He stepped forward once. I was trying to make sure that if Silas dragged your name through the relief ledger, there was a record showing what you are. And what am I? The best mind this town has. She looked at him then. Tired and hurt. That is still not the same as being chosen. The words landed quiet. Cal had no defense clean enough to offer. Behind him, the south pasture ditch moved in the dark, carrying its thin water between the two houses. Mara untied the kerchief from the fence and placed it in his hands. When you decide whether you need me or want me, she said. Bring it back. Then she closed the door. Cal stood on the porch with a blue cloth in his hand. Across town, in the feed store window, Silas Pruitt's lamp was still burning. The county agricultural meeting was supposed to be about winter feed, water rotation, and the rebuilding of 7 damaged farms. Silas Pruitt made sure it became about Mara Ellison. By noon, the grain hall was full. Ranchers stood near stacked wheat sacks. Farmers leaned against the wall below the county notice board. The bank man from Billings sat at a table beside Jory Miles, the cooperative clerk, with a ledger open between them. Mara came in alone. She wore the same plain brown dress she had worn the day after the fire. Her hand was bandaged clean. Under one arm, she carried the relief ledger. Under the other, the cooperative water book. No basket. No jar. No blue kerchief. Cal saw her from the back of the hall and felt the absence of that cloth in his coat pocket like a live coal. Silas stood near the grain scale. Polished boots planted wide. Voice smooth enough to make poison sound reasonable. Nobody is accusing Miss Ellison of bad intent, he said. That was when Cal knew the man intended to do exactly that. Silas continued. But supplies went through her hands. Water barrels. Preserved food. Blankets. Wagon assignments. In a time of fear, records can get confused. It would be best for the town if the matter were reviewed. A few people nodded. Not many. But enough. Mara walked to the table and laid down the relief ledger. Then review it, she said. Silas smiled. Gladly. No. Mara said. Not you. The hall went still. She looked at Jory Miles. The cooperative clerk can read. So can the bankman. Let them follow the numbers. Jory cleared his throat and pulled the ledger closer. Mara stood with her hands folded before her. She did not look at Cal. That hurt. But he understood it. Silas had made this public. So the truth had to stand public too. Jory began with the water barrels. He read each wagon. Each family. Each delivery. Mrs. Wren confirmed the church kitchen count. Tom Vale confirmed 2 barrels taken to his farm. Dale Whitfield confirmed 3 sent east. Then Jory stopped. There are 2 barrels listed as held at Pruitt Feed and Grain. Silas lifted one hand. Store reserve. Necessary in an emergency. Mara set a second paper beside the book. Those barrels came from the cooperative emergency store. Not your private stock. Jory checked the mark. His face changed. The bankman leaned forward. Mara turned a page. Now, the feed prices. Silas's smile faded for the first time. Winter rate charged in August. Mara said. To Cal Rourke. To Tom Vale. To Dale Whitfield. To 3 farms that lost hay in the fire. A murmur moved through the hall. Silas spoke quickly. Prices rise in drought. Yes. Mara said. But not before the drought report is filed. She placed another notice on the table. County date. Feed order date. Price change date. 3 quiet papers. Laid flat under oil lamplight. Did more damage than shouting ever could. Then came the water allotment. Jory Miles read the first list. Tuesday for Rourke Ranch. Mara handed him the second. Thursday. Jory's ears reddened. This isn't my hand. Silas looked toward the door. Cal stepped away from the wall then. Not toward Silas. Toward Mara. But he stopped beside her. Not in front of her. If you had been in that hall, watching a woman stand before every mouth that had ever used her name carelessly, would you have wanted someone to speak for her? Or would you have wanted the town to finally hear her speak for herself? Cal knew his answer now. So he stayed quiet. Nora Vale stood near the flour sacks. Pale and stiff. Beth gripped her sleeve. Then Nora stepped forward. I heard Mr. Pruitt say it. She said. Silas turned on her. Careful. Nora. She swallowed. But kept going. He said folks would question Mara before they questioned a ledger. He said all a town needed was the right doubt placed in the right ear. Beth came beside her. I heard it too. The silence after that was deep. Silas looked smaller in it. The bankman from Billings closed the feed account folder. Mr. Pruitt. This cooperative will not renew your exclusive supply contract until a review is complete. Silas's face hardened. You'll regret that when winter comes. No. Cal said. Every head turned. He took the folded bank renewal from his coat and set it on the table. Mara Ellison's name is on this paper. He said. Not because I need her to make my debt look better. Not because I'm hiding behind her work. Her name is there because the Rourke Ranch has survived this season in part because she saw what I was too proud to see. Mara looked at him then. Cal reached into his coat again and took out the blue kerchief. He laid it beside the renewal. I chose wrong when I chose for you. He said to her. Low enough that it was still hers. But clear enough that the hall heard. I'm asking now. Not as a favor. Not as rescue. As trust. Mara looked at the paper. Then at the room. Then at Cal. For 8 years. The town had made a habit of seeing what was easiest. That afternoon. Under the grain hall lamps. It had to see what was true. Mara picked up the pen. She did not sign fast. She read every line first. Only then did she write her name. The first rain came 3 days after the grain hall meeting. Not a hard rain. Not the kind that made men shout thanks from porches or sent children running barefoot through the yard. It came quiet. A gray curtain over dry Mercy Crossing before dawn. Soft enough that a man could mistake it for mist until it began tapping on the barn roof. The water trough. The porch rail. And the dry earth that had been waiting too long to answer. Cal Rourke stood in the doorway of his barn and watched the south pasture darken under it. For the first time in weeks. The dust stayed down. By noon. The ditch carried real water. Not much. But enough to hear. That mattered. At the cooperative office. Silas Pruitt lost his feed contract before the ink dried on the review order. The bankman from Billings reopened 3 accounts that had been priced under unfair terms. Jory Miles posted the corrected water allotments in the front window. And this time, the list was written in his own hand. With Mara Ellison's figures checked beside it. The relief fund was reopened under 3 signatures. Jory Miles. Mrs. Wren. Mara Ellison. A week later. The cooperative ordered Silas to return the excess charges he had taken during the drought. Not all at once. Men like Silas always found ways to argue over sums, but the first envelopes went out before the month ended. Tom Vale received one. Dale Whitfield received one. Cal received one too. He did not spend it. He placed it on the kitchen table and waited until Mara came in from the pump. She looked at the envelope. What is that? Money Silas should never have taken. You earned it back. No. Cal said. You read it back. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down and opened the envelope herself. That mattered too. Silas did not leave town. Men like him seldom did. But after that week, fewer men leaned on his counter. Fewer ranchers accepted his numbers without asking. When he stepped into the saloon, talk did not stop for him anymore. It moved around him. That was not ruin. But it was consequence. Nora Vale and Beth Vale came to Mara's porch the following Sunday. They did not come with speeches. They came with a new jar of preserved peaches wrapped in a clean white cloth. Nora held it out with both hands. Her face stiff from the effort of doing right after doing wrong for too long. We can't mend what we said. She told Mara. No. Mara said. Beth swallowed. But we can stop saying it. Mara looked at the jar. Then, at the two women. That would be a beginning. She took the peaches. Not forgiveness entire. Not friendship. Just a door opened wide enough for truth to pass through. That evening, Cal came across the road carrying a folded paper. The blue kerchief. And his hat in one hand. Mara was at the pump, washing mud from her boots. The rain had stopped. But drops still fell from the cottonwood leaves one at a time. You're late, she said. For what? For standing there trying to decide how to say something simple. That almost made him smile. Almost. He held out the paper. The bank renewal. He said. Signed. Filed. Witnessed. I know. I saw Jory post the notice. This is different. Mara dried her hands on her apron and took it. She read slowly. Cal waited. He had learned that waiting was not the same thing as fear. Her name was there. Not tucked under his. Not written as a courtesy. Written as partner over ranch accounts. Water management. And cooperative dealings for Rourke Ranch. Mara looked up. I didn't ask you to sign it. Cal said. I'm asking if you still want it there. The ditch moved behind them, carrying the first good water of the season toward the pasture. Mara folded the paper once. You understand what this means? Yes. It means debt too. I know. It means bad years don't belong to only one of us. I know that too. She held his eyes. And if I step into that ranch, I step in by my own name. Not because you feel sorry. Not because you finally noticed what everyone else missed. Cal looked toward the pasture. Then back at her. You step in because I want the life that has you in it. He said. And because I should have been brave enough to know that sooner. Mara did not answer right away. The old cracked peach jar sat on her kitchen shelf behind the window. Empty now. Cleaned of syrup. Its split glass catching the dull gray light. She had kept it. Not because it was useful. Because it remembered the day she stopped pretending nothing hurt. At last. She took the blue kerchief from Cal's hand and tied it around the fence rail between their two houses. Not on his side. Not on hers. Between. All right. She said. Cal let out a breath he had been holding for 8 years. From then on, every paper that came to Rourke Ranch was placed on the kitchen table before Cal signed it. Feed contract. Water order. Bank notice. Cooperative record. Sometimes Mara read every line. Sometimes she only looked at Cal and nodded. The point was not that he had forgotten how to make decisions. The point was that he had finally learned not to call loneliness responsibility. 2 weeks later, Mara walked back into the church kitchen. The same long table stood under the window. The same stove sat black and heavy in the corner. The same white cloth had been washed, folded, and laid out again for another relief supper. For one moment. Every woman in the room went quiet. Mara set the new jar of peaches on the table. Gently this time. No glass cracked. No syrup ran. Nora Vale stepped aside, giving her room without making a ceremony of it. Beth handed her a clean spoon. Mrs. Wren glanced over from the stove and said, We're short on plates. Mara rolled up her sleeves. I know where they keep the extras. That was all. No speech. No apology asked for in front of everyone. Just Mara Ellison standing in the room that had once tried to make her smaller. Taking up the space she needed. And letting the room learn how to make room around her. A few evenings later, Cal found her on the porch after supper. There was no ledger in her lap. No basket at her feet. No crisis waiting in the yard. Mara sat with both hands folded. watching the last water shine along the ditch. For once, she was not fixing, carrying, counting, feeding, or holding anyone together. Cal lowered himself into the chair beside her. She glanced at him. There's nothing to do out here. I know. No papers to read. I know that too. She looked back toward the pasture. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Cal reached across the small space between the chairs and took her hand. Not because she had saved his ranch. Not because she had read a ledger right. Not because the town had finally learned her worth. Just because she was there. Mara's fingers closed around his. They did not marry that day. They did not need to hurry what had already taken so long. They married in the ranch yard when the south pasture had gone green again and the first calves were strong on their legs. Mrs. Wren stood near the gate. Reverend Tully read the words. Tobe cried and pretended he had dust in his eyes. On the kitchen table, Mara placed the new jar of peaches. On the shelf above it, she kept the cracked one. Years later, when the debt was paid and the ditch ran clean each spring, Cal would still find Mara on the porch at sundown, watching water move through the pasture grass. And every time, he remembered the woman he had almost let remain across the road. The rain had come late that year. So had he. But the ground had taken both in. The south pasture held green. The kitchen light burned warm. The cracked jar stayed on the shelf. Not hidden. Not mended. Not thrown away. It did not mean hurt anymore. It meant the day Mara stopped carrying silence for people who had never deserved it. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.